He said it lightly, almost kindly, like a verdict wrapped in velvet. A smile, a nod, a quiet replacement already waiting in the wings. She didn't argue, didn't defend, just closed her laptop as if sealing something far bigger than a conversation, and walked out without looking back. No scene, no resistance, just silence, the kind that lingers longer than any speech. And in that silence, something shifted, something no one in that room noticed yet. The office didn't react immediately. That was the first odd detail. No gasps, no whispers, just the faint, sterile hum of ventilation and the distant clicking of keyboards that hadn't yet realized they were typing into a different reality. Her chair was still slightly warm, angled toward the table like it expected her to return. It didn't know better. Not yet. The VP adjusted his cufflinks as if he had just concluded a routine calendar meeting. Clean execution, efficient transition. That's how he would frame it later, if anyone asked. But no one did. Not out loud. Because everyone had seen it. Not just the words, but the way she stood up. No hesitation, no confusion, no flicker of panic. Just certainty. The kind that doesn't ask permission. Across the table, the new hire, young, sharp, visibly polished, sat a little straighter now. This was her moment. Or at least, it was supposed to be. She opened her laptop quickly, fingers hovering above the keyboard with a readiness that felt rehearsed. She glanced once at the VP. He gave a subtle nod. Green light. But something was off. The system dashboard loaded slower than usual. A delay so small it could be dismissed, unless you knew what normal looked like. The new hire frowned, just slightly. Clicked refresh. Waited. Behind her, one of the senior analysts leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes narrowing at the screen. He didn't say anything. Not yet. But he had that look. The one people get when a pattern breaks. Should be instant, he muttered, barely above a whisper. No one responded. The VP remained standing, hands behind his back now, observing like this was still under control. Because it was. It had to be. Right? The dashboard finally appeared. Numbers aligned, graphs stable, clean, predictable, almost too perfect. See? The VP said, voice calm, controlled. Continuity. The word hung in the air like a statement that needed to be believed. The new hire nodded, though her eyes didn't fully agree. She navigated deeper, pulling reports, opening dependencies, accessing internal workflows. Everything was there, structurally intact, functionally sound, but there was a lag, a subtle drag beneath the surface, like a system that remembered something missing, even if it couldn't name it. On the far end of the table, someone cleared their throat. Another glance, another unspoken question. The VP noticed. Of course he did. We'll monitor performance, he added, slightly sharper now. No disruptions expected. Expected. The word landed differently this time, because expectation is not control, and control has a way of revealing itself only after it's gone. Outside, through the glass wall, the office carried on. Calls, meetings, movement, business as usual. But inside that room, something quieter was unfolding. Not a failure, not yet. A delay, a hesitation, a system adjusting to the absence of someone it was never designed to lose. And somewhere, far from that conference room, her laptop remained closed. Not forgotten. Just finished. At least, that's what they thought. And that assumption, quiet, reasonable, almost invisible, would cost more than anyone in that room was ready to calculate. Somewhere in the back end, a timer ticked. No alert, no warning. Just a sequence waiting for its moment. And when it reached zero, the definition of continuity would change. Something had already started, and no one in that room had the access to stop it. By midday, the room had changed, not visibly. Not in any way you could point to in a report or annotate in a slide deck. But the rhythm, The invisible cadence of how things moved, loaded, responded, was no longer clean. It dragged, just enough to force attention, just enough to disrupt confidence. The first escalation came quietly. A regional operations lead sent a message. Seeing inconsistencies in allocation logic, can someone confirm? It was phrased politely, carefully, like someone testing the water before admitting something was wrong. The new hire saw it first, opened the thread, scanned the logs. Everything looked correct. The formulas were intact. The rules hadn't changed. And yet the output, the result, was subtly off. Not broken, not crashing, just wrong enough to matter. She replied with a measured line. Reviewing. Will confirm shortly. Shortly didn't come, because 5 minutes later, another message appeared. Different region, same tone, same issue, different numbers. Across the floor, screens began to light up with similar patterns, small deviations, minor mismatches, each one individually dismissible. Together? Not so much. The senior analyst from earlier stood up without saying anything, walked out of the conference room and toward the operations cluster. He didn't need permission. He had seen this before, the early signs of something systemic. Behind him, the VP remained still, watching, calculating. Status? He asked finally. The new hire hesitated for half a second too long. It's minor inconsistencies, she said. Nothing critical. Nothing critical. Another word that needed to be true. But the analyst was already pulling raw data, bypassing dashboards, digging directly into the structure beneath. His fingers moved faster now, not from panic, but from recognition. He wasn't searching randomly. He was tracing something, and then he stopped. Just for a moment. His eyes narrowed. Not in confusion, in understanding. Where's the override layer? He asked, turning back toward the room. Silence. The new hire blinked. The what? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked back in, slower now, like someone carrying a realization that wouldn't land well. She built a manual override logic on top of the automated system, he said. Invisible layer. It corrected edge cases the base model couldn't handle. The VP's expression didn't change. That wasn't in the documentation, the new hire said quickly. No, the analyst replied. It wouldn't be. Because the system wasn't just code. It was decisions. Thousands of them. Small adjustments, exceptions, corrections made in real time, based on patterns only one person had learned to recognize. It didn't live in files. It lived in her. And now, it wasn't there. The room felt smaller. Can we rebuild it? The VP asked, voice still controlled. The analyst exhaled slowly. Not quickly. Across the office, alerts began to multiply. Still not red, still not critical, but louder now, more frequent, less ignorable. A chain reaction doesn't start with a crash. It starts with drift. Numbers slightly off lead to decisions slightly wrong. Decisions slightly wrong lead to allocations misaligned. And misalignment, at scale, doesn't announce itself. It compounds. The new hire was moving faster now, opening tabs, cross-referencing outputs, trying to force coherence back into a system that no longer recognized its own edges. This doesn't make sense, she said, almost to herself. It did. Just not to her. Because she was reading the system. And the system had been reading something else entirely. Something human. Something gone. The VP stepped closer to the table now. No more distance. No more observation from the perimeter. Stabilize it, he said. Not a request, a directive. But directives don't replace missing architecture. And architecture, once removed, doesn't negotiate. Somewhere in finance, a preliminary report refreshed. Numbers updated, margins tightened. Loss projections recalculated. Not dramatically, not explosively, but with a quiet precision that made them more dangerous. One line changed, then another, then a third. And by the time someone noticed the pattern, the total had already crossed a threshold no one wanted to say out loud. $70 million. No alarms, no flashing screens. Just a number, sitting there. Accurate, unapologetic, expensive. The VP didn't speak. The room didn't move. Because in that moment, everyone understood something at the same time. She hadn't taken anything. She had simply stopped holding it together. And that difference was everything. They thought they replaced a person. They didn't realize they removed a system no one else could even see. If you've ever seen a simple replacement turn into a silent collapse, subscribe now, because what happens next isn't about blame. It's about leverage. Leave a comment. Would you have stayed or walked out the same way? And stay until the end, because in the next chapter, they try to fix what they don't fully understand. And that's where it gets dangerous. By the next morning, the language had changed. No one said minor inconsistencies anymore. Now it was containment. The word appeared first in an internal thread, then in a call invite, then, quietly, in the subject line of a meeting no one wanted to attend, but everyone joined anyway. Because when language tightens, it's rarely a coincidence. The VP entered 5 minutes early. He didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, reviewing a printed report he hadn't touched before. Paper, actual paper. As if holding something physical might stabilize numbers that refused to stay still on a screen. The new hire arrived last. Not late, just last. Her laptop was already open before she sat down. Tabs layered over tabs. Logs, outputs, models, fragments of a system she was still trying to reconstruct in real time. Her posture was controlled. Her breathing wasn't. "Update," the VP said. No preamble. She nodded once. "We've isolated the variants to edge case handling. The core model is intact, but..." "But?" he pressed. She hesitated, because the word she needed didn't sound technical. "It's adaptive," she said finally. Or it was. The system isn't just applying rules. It was adjusting based on context we can't fully trace. The senior analyst leaned back slightly, arms crossed. "Context you can't see," he corrected. "A subtle difference, a significant one." On the screen, a timeline appeared. Data points plotted across regions, each showing deviation patterns. Not identical, but related. Like echoes of the same decision, interpreted differently in different places. Every time the system hits a non-standard scenario, the new hire continued, it defaults to base logic, which means it guesses, the analyst said. Silence. Because guessing at this scale doesn't feel like a calculation, it feels like risk. The VP placed the report down, slowly. Options. One word, clean, controlled. But underneath it, pressure. The new hire swallowed, then spoke faster than before, as if speed could compensate for certainty. "We can attempt a manual patch layer, rebuild a simplified override logic based on observed deviations. It won't be perfect, but it could stabilize outputs short-term." "How long?" the VP asked. "A few days to deploy something functional, weeks to refine." Weeks. The word hung heavier than the numbers. The analyst shook his head slightly. "You're not rebuilding logic," he said. "You're approximating judgment." Another subtle difference. Another significant one. Because judgment isn't just what you do. It's why you do it. Across the table, someone from finance cleared their throat. "We've rerun projections," they said, voice steady but tight. "If the current drift continues, we're looking at sustained impact beyond the initial figure." No one said the number again. They didn't need to. Everyone in that room could still see it. $70 million. Static. Silent. Unavoidable. The VP's gaze shifted. Not to the screen, not to the data, but to the empty chair at the far end of the table. The one no one had moved. Not out of respect. Out of habit. "Contact her," he said. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it changed the room instantly. The new hire looked up. On what basis? A fair question. A dangerous one. The VP didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted his cuff again, slower this time. Professional continuity, he said. The phrase sounded structured, neutral, strategic. It wasn't. It was a recalibration. Because 3 days ago, continuity meant replacement. Now it meant recovery. The analyst glanced down at the table, then back at the VP. She won't respond to that, he said. The VP met his glad. Then we'll adjust the message. Across the screen, another deviation appeared. Then another. Not spikes, not failures. Just a steady, quiet accumulation of misalignment. The kind that doesn't crash a system. The kind that slowly makes it unreliable. And unreliability, at scale, is more expensive than any single failure. The new hire closed one of her tabs. Then another. Not because she was done, because she was starting to understand. This wasn't written to be handed over, she said softly. No one disagreed. Because some systems aren't built for transition. They're built for ownership. And ownership, once removed, doesn't leave instructions behind. It leaves absence. The VP turned toward the window. The city outside looked exactly the same as it had 3 days ago. Same movement, same noise, same illusion of control. Inside, the equation had changed. We'll reach out, he repeated. But this time, it sounded less like a decision and more like an admission. Because when you finally realize what something was worth, you're already negotiating from a position you didn't expect to be in. And somewhere, beyond their reach, she hadn't even opened her laptop yet. They didn't call her immediately. That was the second mistake. The first had already cost them clarity. The second would cost them time. And time, at this stage, translated directly into numbers no one wanted to see updated again. Instead, they drafted 3 versions of the same message. Version 1, neutral. We'd like to discuss recent system behavior and ensure a smooth operational transition. Version 2, appreciative. Your prior contributions remain critical to current stability. We'd value your input. Version 3, strategic. There may be an opportunity to collaborate on a short-term advisory basis. They debated tone like tone was the variable that mattered. It wasn't, because tone assumes position, and their position had already shifted. The VP read each version twice, then set them aside. Send the third, he said. Of course, because it implied control, without admitting loss. The message went out at 11:12 a.m. Delivered. Seen. No reply. At 11:19, someone refreshed the thread. Still nothing. At 11:26, the new hire opened another log file. Not because it would help, but because waiting without action felt worse. At 11:31, finance updated the projection again. No announcement this time, just a silent revision. Upward. The analyst didn't look at the number. He didn't need to. He was watching something else entirely, response latency across systems. The delay had deepened. Not dramatically, just enough to confirm what he already knew. The drift wasn't stabilizing. It was learning, adapting to its own errors, reinforcing them, a feedback loop without correction. Did we include scope? He asked suddenly. The VP glanced up. What? In the message. Did we define scope? A pause. No. Another small decision. Another subtle cost. Because without scope, a request isn't a contract. It's a favor. And favors depend on willingness. At 11:43, the reply came. One line. No greeting. No signature. Just. Define scope. The room didn't exhale, but something in it shifted. The VP read it once, then again. Not surprised. But not entirely prepared either. She's engaging, the new hire said, almost relieved. No, the analyst replied quietly. She's positioning. Another difference, another important one. The VP sat down now, finally. Draft response, he said. This time, faster. No debate about tone, only structure. Scope defined as temporary advisory support. Access described as limited and secure. Timeline framed as urgent but flexible. Compensation left open. They hesitated there. Of course they did, because naming a number makes something real. And reality, at this point, was already expensive. Send it, the VP said. The message went out at 11:58. 12 minutes passed. No reply. 15. 20. The new hire checked system outputs again. Not better, not worse. Just consistently off. The analyst stood by the window now, watching reflections instead of data. Whatever she built, he said, almost to himself. It wasn't just logic. No one asked him to explain, because they were starting to feel it. The system wasn't failing loudly, it was degrading intelligently, choosing wrong answers that looked right, until they weren't. At 12:27, the reply arrived. Longer this time, still precise. Advisory requires full visibility, no limited access. Define decision authority, define liability, define compensation. 4 lines, 4 conditions, no emotion, no negotiation language, just structure. The VP leaned back slowly, because now the conversation had changed again. This wasn't recovery, this was re-entry, on her terms. The new hire read the message twice, then closed her laptop halfway. Just enough to pause, not enough to disengage. She's not asking for a role, she said. No, the analyst agreed. She's defining one. Across the table, the numbers refreshed again. No one looked, because for the first time since she left, the numbers weren't the most important variable in the room. Control was. And control had just shifted. The VP picked up his pen, not to sign anything. Not yet. Just to hold something steady. Draft terms, he said. But this time, his voice was quieter, measured differently, because somewhere between the silence, the drift, and 4 short lines of text, they had crossed a threshold no one had planned for, and coming back from it wouldn't look anything like the way they left. They thought they were asking for help. They didn't realize they were being evaluated. They moved faster now, not because they had a plan, but because they no longer had the luxury of hesitation. Drafting terms wasn't a strategy. It was an admission that the structure they relied on had already been externalized. The document came together in fragments. Legal opened a template. Finance added constraints. Operations inserted urgency between lines that were trying to sound neutral. Temporary advisory engagement. Immediate system stabilization. Expedited compensation framework. Words designed to sound controlled. But control at this point was mostly formatting. Define decision authority, the VP said, reading her message again. What exactly does she expect? The analyst didn't look up from the screen. Authority, he said, isn't what she expects. A pause. It's what she requires. Another subtle correction. Another shift in gravity. Because expectation can be negotiated. Requirement cannot. They added a clause. Advisory input subject to internal approval. It looked reasonable, balanced, safe. The analyst shook his head immediately. She'll reject that. Why? The new hire asked. Because it puts her inside the problem, he replied, not above it. Silence. Because that was the point no one had said out loud yet. She wasn't coming back to assist. She was being asked to restore. And restoration doesn't happen from within the same constraints that caused the failure. The VP crossed out the line. No replacement, just absence. Legal shifted uncomfortably. We need liability boundaries, someone said. Of course they did. Because liability defines risk. And risk, at $70 million and rising, is no longer theoretical. They added another clause. Company retains full liability for prior system behavior. That one stayed, because even now they understood one thing clearly. What had already happened belonged to them. At 1342, the draft was ready, structured, clean, careful, and incomplete in all the ways that mattered. "Send it," the VP said. No one argued. The message went out. This time, no one refreshed the thread immediately. They waited. Because now, the response wasn't just a reply. It was a decision. 5 minutes. 7. 10. The office around them continued its usual motion. Calls, footsteps, muted conversations. But inside that room, time felt isolated, measured differently, like everything depended on a single variable they couldn't influence anymore. At 1358, her response arrived. No greeting, no delay in tone, just one line. Add execution authority. The VP read it once, then again. The new hire leaned forward. Execution, as in, "She doesn't want to advise," the analyst said quietly. "She wants to act." Another line followed, seconds later. Compensation, performance-based, defined against recovered value. Finance looked up immediately. Because now, the structure had changed again. Not fixed. Changed. This wasn't cost. This was alignment. Pay tied to outcome. Risk shared. Selectively. Reward scaled. Proportionally. The VP exhaled slowly. For the first time since the meeting began, it wasn't controlled. It was calculated. "Can we quantify recovery?" someone asked. The analyst didn't answer right away. He was looking at the system metrics again, the drift, the misalignment, the subtle compounding errors that had turned into a number no one wanted to repeat. "Yes," he said finally, "but not precisely." Of course, because precision requires stability, and stability was exactly what they didn't have. The VP stood up, not abruptly, not dramatically, just decisively. "Accept," he said. Legal opened their mouth, then closed it. Finance hesitated, then nodded. The new hire didn't move, because she understood something now that hadn't been clear 3 days ago. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a recalibration of reality. The VP typed the response himself. No delegation, no revision loops. Just a single line. Execution authority granted. Performance terms accepted. Access will be provided immediately. He paused for half a second before sending. Not to reconsider, just to recognize the moment. Then, sent. No one spoke, because they all felt it. The shift, the transfer, the exact point where control didn't disappear. It moved, somewhere else. At 14:07, her reply came. 2 words. Send access. No punctuation, no emphasis, no acknowledgement of anything that came before. Because for her, this wasn't resolution, it was the beginning. Across the system, nothing changed immediately. No instant recovery, no sudden correction. Just the same quiet drift. The same subtle misalignment. The same number, waiting. $70 million. Unmoved. But for the first time since it appeared, it didn't feel final. It felt temporary. The VP closed his laptop slowly, not because the situation was resolved, because it had entered a different phase. And phases like this don't unfold in meetings, they unfold in control. And somewhere, at that exact moment, she opened her laptop, and when she did, the system finally stopped guessing.